Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure working with the guys at Clearer Thinking. I used to work in the cutthroat world of advertising, where everything was very competitive and slightly evil. And so it's really nice working with other nonprofits where we're trying to do good things together, and it's very kumbaya. So I'm going to share my screen and open up a Keynote file. So can everyone see that okay? Cool. Brilliant. So today we're going to be looking at what divergent thinking is, what creative thinking is, and some ways to use it. It's not just for pretentious people and artistic types. It's actually pretty universal. So the first bit, as Josh mentioned, we'll be looking at some of the theoretical aspects, and then we're going to go into a more practical aspect. And at the end, we'll be doing a Q&A. If you have any technical issues, if you're involved in the interactive session, you can DM in the Zoom chat the guy whose name is James Gill. He's the lovely hairy man who is our CTO. There's a few of us that are hairy, but he's more hairy than most of us. If you want to DM him, if you have any problems accessing the FigJam file or anything like that, he will try to sort it out for you to the best of his ability, and his ability is pretty good, so he should be right. So the first thing to mention is that there are going to be prizes today for the best idea in the interactive session when we get to that part. And the first prize is the full bundle set from Kitted Thinking Tools, which is something that we've been developing over the last 3 years, valued at $400. And it's basically a bunch of thinking prompts on a whole lot of different areas that could be useful for business, education, professional development, that sort of thing. I'll bang on a little bit more about that later on, somewhat sheepishly and self-consciously, because it's always weird talking about your own stuff. Now, the first prize is for the best idea. There's a second prize for the second best idea as voted by you, the human beings that are participating today. There's also a third prize, and the third prize is a bit more curious insofar as it will be awarded to the question that results in the most interesting or provocative answer. So if you ask a question in the Zoom chat, Igor is going to be going through and selecting some of those for us to answer at the end. We hopefully will get to as many of them as we can. We may go a little bit long if there's enough capacity to do that. But yeah, please do, if you think of something that you want to ask, please drop it into the chat at any stage during the presentation, and Igor will be compiling those questions for me to have a look at the end, and we can have a discussion then too. Cool. So yeah, ask questions and comments. I was meant to be on that slide when I said that, but here we are. So misconceptions about creativity. I am a dad to 3 boys, so I am fully licensed for dad pun jokes. Apologies in advance, kind of, for all that ensues on that level. The first misconception about creativity is when people say something to the effect of, I'm just not a very creative person. I haven't a creative bone in my body. And when you think about it, there's an Australianism we like to say down here in the land of Oz, which is yeah, nah, which, because Australians don't like to be negative, so we need to say something positive beforehand before we say negative. We go, yeah, nah. Everyone is creative because it's part of problem solving quite intrinsically. And so it's part of the human experience and not something we can avoid, much as we don't like to think of ourselves that way. But Picasso famously said every 4-year-old is an artist. And I think that's, largely true. But what's interesting is that as a dad of 3 boys, a lot of the artwork that I was presented with when my kids were 4 years old was of dubious artistic merit, to be entirely candid with you. And the truth is that they hadn't developed all the skills yet, but what they did have was a boldness and an attitude of creative exploration that was unfettered by anything else. So perhaps the more accurate way of saying it is, rather than that every 4-year-old is an artist, is every 4-year-old is creative. Picasso remixed here, because it's really about being open and explorative and not having our little spirits crushed. And why do we have our spirits crushed? Well, after kindergarten, where we're told that it's fun to be creative and we have a wonderful time doing so, we go into something called school, which you may have heard of and experienced in your life as a human being that lives in the modern world. And if you remember what that experience is like, where you may still be in the midst of it, the reality within the school system is that there is only one correct answer. There's a lot of standardized testing, and the worst thing you can possibly do is to be wrong, or you will essentially lose at the game of school. And it's not just the institutionalized aspect of our school system that has this, this mode of deductive, reductionist, only one right answer, don't be wrong mindset. It's also something that's socialized as well. So we're taught that, to be different and to be out there and to play and to be vulnerable is something that we ought to suppress in ourselves socially as well. So both institutionally and socially, for the ensuing 10 to 20 years, that bold, beautiful, creative spirit that we all were when we were 3 or 4 years old gets fashioned into something else through a steady and crushing process of reinforced learning. And then we get out into the real world and we're at jobs, and if we're lucky enough to be in a position where we might actually do more than just spin a cog in a wheel, then we can be really quite spectacularly rewarded if we do something called innovation. That is a buzzword that people use and presume to know what it means. But what it actually means is creative thinking. That's what you're doing when you're doing any innovation. And we come out of the system of being conditioned to think in this way that is basically fear-based, right? We have a fear-based mode of thinking that is inculcated in how we interface with the world, and especially to do with our work. We are taught and we condition ourselves that play is something we do when we're not working, we're not thinking about anything seriously. That's just to have fun. When we're doing work, we're doing something very different. And those neurons that fire together and wire together are taught and reinforced to only be doing a certain type of thinking, a more deductive, reductive, and inductive to some extent mode of thinking, which is more analytical and convergent. So there is this really kind of deep misconception, as we talked about, that creativity is something that is something we've lost. And in some ways we have. What that school system does is that it crushes our open explorative spirit, our desire to be vulnerable, our capacity to be vulnerable. But we're still creative, right? So we need to delineate and tease these things apart. Programmers, rational skeptics, and scientists are deeply creative people, right? If you're coming up with a software architecture problem, a solution to a problem, or you're working on if you're a rational skeptic and you're looking at hang on, let's just question this narrative, you're thinking divergently, or scientists hypothesizing something. All of these things are seen to be deeply convergent, reductive, analytical modes of thought, but they are in fact quite creative in a lot of ways. But what they are not is expressive and open and explorative in the way that maybe their potential could be. So we're still doing that creativity, but maybe it's quite suboptimal in a lot of ways, because that aspect of how we think has been conditioned and suppressed over quite a long period of time. So to be creative, it's not just okay to be wrong, it's absolutely necessary. And a common other misconception about creativity is that it's something we see the result of a creative process. We see an artistic work, a song, anything that's something we go, oh, that person's a creative genius, they're fantastic. And what we're not privy to, and what they often don't share with us, is that the process of getting to that point has been laughably tragic and misaligned and full of mistakes and terribly embarrassing iterations that they would never want to show to the world, right? And we have this dissonance when we're involved in our own creative projects, where we have imposter syndrome and we go, oh, I'm terrible, and this is stupid. Why did I even think that was a good idea? And we finally maybe fumble our way through if we have to, because we feel so uncomfortable about it. Most people do, even people that work in the creative industries professionally. It's still something that we feel really uncomfortable, like being vulnerable and trying to come up with these new ways of doing things, because it feels weird and different and not of the norm. And we get to the end of that process and we go, oh, like I have put myself out there and I've kind of got through this thing, but am I in a position where I can actually be comfortable with that? Is that something that I am okay to own? Probably not to a large extent. I'm still going to be in that fear-based mindset to a large extent. So being wrong and being okay with being wrong and being comfortable with being uncomfortable is a really important aspect of it. And we all have that imposter syndrome and that dissonance that we have between thinking that creative geniuses and creative professionals and all these other people are somehow creating these works of genius and they seem so confident about it. The reality is that a lot of the time they're just muddling their way through like everyone else, right? And it's kind of true for everybody. For instance, when I was doing like the artwork for this slide, I was using Midjourney, which incidentally cannot recommend enough. It is just the most wonderful toy to play with in the visual sphere. Learning the prompt craft of it is a little bit of a learning curve, but my gosh, it's worth it. It's amazing. Excuse me. So I put as the prompt for this slide, I went, a mountain of scrunched up balls of paper to represent, all of the wrong ideas that get you to something that's, worthwhile at the end. And the interesting thing is that when you start out in a creative process, if you think you know what the end point is going to be, that's kind of the worst thing you can do, right? Because the whole point of it is to explore and to try new things. And if you're not open and receptive to pivoting and exploring things along the way, it's going to be an extremely suboptimal process. And so this doesn't really look like a scrunched up balls of paper making a mountain, but I just really love the aesthetic, and so just kind of like getting more comfortable with your own predilections and like trying things and going in intuitive, interesting directions divergently is something that I've become more comfortable the more I've done it over time. So this is the screen with some of the results that Midjourney spat back at me. And you can do so many different iterations and different styles. And, that's a really important part of it too, is to be iterative and to be okay with, trying things out and attempting to do things in, a varied and open and iterative synthesized fashion. But what is creative thinking and what isn't it? So to define it, I think a good heuristic is that it is making new connections. That's a kind of good, in a nutshell, way of looking at it. But that's kind of like the end point of it, is you've made a new connection. That's kind of like, but the process itself is interesting to examine. So one of the ways I think about it is like, can you ask what if yes equals creative thinking, Another is like making the noise. And I think that probably in a lot of ways, play itself is any kind of play and exploration is a good kind of thing. But the best way to define creative thinking, to my mind, is to actually think about it in terms of what it isn't, which is convergent thinking. And putting those two as a dichotomy, as a contrast to each other, really helps to clarify what's going on when we're doing the work of creative thinking, which is to think outwardly, right? To think divergently is to be open, playful, agnostic, creative, explorative. And that is contrasted by convergent thinking, in which we're thinking more analytically, deductively, probabilistically, evaluatively, trying to drill things down. Now, the mistake that can be often made when thinking about this in a dichotomous way is to think that, oh, well, there's one and there's the other, and, they're two different modes of thought. But of course, it's a little more complicated than that. And I find that taking those two things, the divergent and convergent, and then putting them into this kind of rubric of having a different process to think about how we think as an action, as a verb, as a thing that we do, which is something that we call the meta thinking process. It's one of our tools in the kitted deck of cards. And the basic premise here is to acquire knowledge to start with. So the heuristic is deep, wide, narrow, up. Deep is to research and define, understand the subject matter of what you're talking about. So this could be, whether it's a strategic imperative that you're working on, whether it's a brief that you're working on, a new business, a product that you're designing, anything that requires deep thought, following a process like this can maybe help as a framework to not just do the kind of messy, unstructured way that we tend to go about things, which could be good to some extent, but actually putting some structure around it where we, quite clear about the steps involved. First being to go deep with research and define, understand the market reality, for example, what is the customer's perspective, look at some user stories, all these sorts of things that give us a deep knowledge-based understanding of what's going on. And once we have that, once we've gathered all of that knowledge, once we have an understanding without judgment as much as we can about what's going on, only then going in the divergent way of doing things and thinking, okay, well, let's consider all of the possibilities. And some of the tools that we use within the kitted system are specifically about thinking, well, what would happen if there's no limits? There was no budget, there was no time constraints. What would we do? Or what's the opposite of, the pain point, or, all these sorts of things that are provocations to be able to think about, what are the possibilities and think wide. And probably the best tool, and one that we'll use in the interactive session today, is 10 ideas in 10 minutes. And the reason that's such a good tool is that that internal critic that has been conditioned for the past, however many years that you've spent in both school and corporate life, if we're to be honest, is constantly telling you, no, you shouldn't worry about it. And it's suppressing your creative flow state, right? And so what 10 ideas in 10 minutes does is it forces you to be creative, because you have to come up with 10 ideas in 10 minutes. So they don't have to be good ideas. You're given the permission to come up with bad ideas. In fact, you're encouraged to come up with bad ideas. And in doing so, as soon as the first 2-3 ideas come out of you, something really interesting shifts. There's a mindset shift, and you can sort of almost see it physically while people are working, where they get into that flow state, and then the pen is moving, the fingers are flowing on the keyboard, whatever it is. And you can quite physically see that a shift happens from being kind of like in an introverted, fear-based state of like not being sure what you're doing, to being in that 4-year-old again who's, willing to be vulnerable enough to try things out. Because you have to come up with the 10 ideas, and that forces you to quiet that internal critic and start to generate a quantity of ideas. And quantity over quality is perhaps the most important thing to know about divergent creative thinking. Coming up with lots of ideas is far more important than coming up with high quality ideas when you're thinking divergently, because the idea is to explore possibilities and to try and, go off on tangents and try new things before you criticize them, before you try and drill it down, because there's often a map of possibilities that we don't even consider because we get stuck in our own heuristic ruts of one form or another. Then, and only then, do we bring in the convergent thinking. And a lot of the time, a lot of people just play to the strengths of their own personalities and predilections, right? So the artists and creative spirits and drama dorks all go in for the wide divergent thinking, and they come up with lots of fantastic, wonderful, crazy ideas, and then entirely fail to hold any of them to rational account, right? And all of the, quant math nerd, logical people tend to like drill right down into the most, logical solutions straight away without thinking about all the possibilities. And so what happens when you put those things together, when you play to your weaknesses rather than your strengths by, elevating and prompting yourself to be able to do both of those things, is that you multiply the potential of what you can do in terms of your output by several orders of magnitude, I would guess, in a very sort of loose way, but with some experiential empirical evidence behind it. So deep, wide, narrow, and then the most important one is the last one, which is up, which is about synthesization and iteration. Because what we will tend to do, and what I did when I was a young art director and designer, is that as soon as I got a good idea, I would cling to that so hard because that uncomfortable state of not knowing what it was that I, was going to do was a bait. It's like, oh, my goodness, I've actually got something that is going to work, And then you get all the confirmation biases coming in and any kind of criticism that you or anybody else makes of them. It's like, no, it can work. I know it can work. And so learning to be open at the end of a process where you've gotten to a good idea to go, but what if again? What if we go back and we be divergent again? We've gone through this process. We've understood the brief. We've done this wide divergent thinking. We've narrowed it down. We've, held up to rational account. It's gone through this gauntlet. And now what you want to, now if you synthesize, if you iterate, if you pivot, if you, then try and do it some more, that's where you go from good to great. That's where the magic stuff happens. And that's where almost no one does the things. So I highly recommend just following that as a process and pushing yourself beyond the first good idea you get to when you're doing a brainstorming session or, a strategy session or anything else that has divergent thinking in it. Anecdotally, I saw a presentation a couple of years ago for, I think it was Wired magazine. And they had a process for their artwork where they would take the article, and they had really nice artwork for their articles, and they would have a designer or an art director come up with this, this layout, and it was really beautiful, and they'd spent, a week or two working on this thing to make it all just work perfectly. And then they would give that to another designer or art director, and they'd say, your brief is to fuck that up. Your brief is to do something just wild and different and mess with it and just do whatever you like. That's what you want to do. And that process of taking someone else's work, giving them the working files, and then doing something completely different with it and, taking it in a different direction produced fantastic results, because we can't help but get attached to our babies along the way. So it's just a really nice demonstration of that final process of up to synthesize and iterate and push beyond is where the real magic happens. So how to build creative muscle. So we're going to do some actual things now. Creativity, like love, is a verb. It can be thought about as a noun, but it's less useful that way. And it's less effective. So to do the thing, we've made a thing. And this is the part where I self-consciously talk about my own product. And actually, I won't very much, because we've made a video that I'm going to share with you that hopefully, actually, you know what? I'm going to stop sharing and reshare with the correct video permission things so that it actually plays for you properly. One moment, please. Share, and then click the buttons. Advanced. Video file. Okay, it's doing it by default for me, so it was actually fine, I think. Share sound. Optimize the video sharing. Yeah, that's it. Okay, cool. We got it. Hit play on this bad boy. And okay.
Don't you find that everything just works so much better when you have the right tools? Introducing Kitted Thinking Tools. Developed by global leaders in higher order thinking, Kitted provides the ultimate professional toolkit with practical exercises, actionable insights, provocative perspectives, and critical thinking prompts. For example, if you wanted to plan or facilitate a workshop, you might use some of these thinking tools to maximize engagement and reach clear outcomes. Or, if you're developing a marketing plan, you might apply some of these thinking tools to optimize your strategy, messaging, and executions. Someone in your team might, for instance, use the scarcity card as a prompt to suggest a limited time offer. You'll feel like you have thinking superpowers because all the ways to reach strategic, clear, and actionable decisions are literally right there in your hands. Select your curated deck or level up to get the full bundle set for 50% off for a limited time.
Cool. So hopefully that explained some aspects. Oh, I think I've lost my Zoom, people. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Hopefully that gave you some indication of what Kitted is about. I'm going to share my screen again. I don't know why I couldn't see you all before. Maybe it's because I had video optimized on. There we go. Cool. So essentially, Kitted is a system whereby all these cards have their own digital web page that has extended expositions, explanations, examples, templates, academic references, and that sort of thing. And what's kind of cool about it, if we do say so ourselves, is that it's modular. So you can use it as a choose your own adventure for any particular purpose, whether it's workshop planning and facilitation, strategy sessions, professional development, product design, UX design, all that sort of thing. Please do check it out. Now, I will mention as well that obviously this is a free webinar, so the selling the thing is this aspect of it. And but I feel better about it because the link that you see here that we'll paste into the chat in a minute and probably at the end as well is an affiliate link for Clearer Thinking. So to support the nonprofit and also to support us, 5% of our profits go back to the School of Thought as well, trying to do good things in the world. If you're curious about using one of these systems to improve your business, your professional development, your workshops, your brainstorming sessions, anything like that, check it out using the link there that will be dropped in the chat, and use the discount code Spencer Greenberg 50 at checkout to be able to get a 50% discount on any of the decks, including a single deck if you want. And also as a special offer as part of this presentation, anyone that buys any decks within the next 48 hours, a Calendly link will be sent around, and I'll be offering a 1-hour onboarding or one-on-one session to take you through any aspect of Kitted and all of this sort of stuff that you may like for yourself and or your team.